Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. I'm happy to bring this week's edition of the show your way. Let's begin with China currents. Stories coming up include the increasingly close interactions between China and Russia across military cooperation, public opinion exchanges, and a surge in cross-border tourism. We'll also look at a heated national debate unfolding in China over whether drug abuse records should be sealed or remain accessible. Plus, China has revealed a remarkable interplanetary-style rescue process that was completed in just 20 days, highlighting new advances in rapid response engineering. These and many other stories are coming up shortly. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents. In this episode, more engagement between China and Russia in the military sphere, among the general public and in tourism. A heated national debate in China on whether drug use records should be disclosed. China's Starship-style rocket recovery fails, but experts say the experience remains invaluable. China unveils a space rescue mission completed in only 20 days. And former University of Cambridge Vice-Chancellor joins Zhejiang University. Now let's start today's China Currents. Last week, we witnessed a rise in interactions between China and Russia. On December 1st, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a presidential decree allowing Chinese citizens to enter Russia visa-free for tourism and business purposes from now until September 14, 2026, with a maximum stay of 30 days. Together with China's visa-free policy for Russian citizens introduced in early September, citizens of the two countries can now travel to each other's countries with minimal restrictions. Within half an hour of the announcement, travel searches related to Russia surged more than twofold in China. Since November, searches for flights from China to Russia have continued to rise, and hotel bookings for Russia as a primary destination have increased by more than 40% year-on-year. Beyond facilitating people-to-people exchange, the Russian government also issued a direct and explicit statement regarding the recent China-Japan dispute over the Taiwan issue. On December 2nd, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi traveled to Russia for China-Russia strategic security consultations. Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, who waited for Wang Yi at the entrance, made his stance on Japan clear. The hydra of militarism is raising its head again, but Russia and China have enough experience to cut it off. He further noted that some European countries and Japan harbor desires to revenge and seek to make up for their past failures. We will not allow any criminal regime to be revived in Europe or Tokyo. In a Chinese press release, this diplomatic engagement was described as strategic time alignment on issues related to Japan. The term strategic time alignment, or 对表, literally referring to soldiers synchronizing their watches before an operation, was deliberately chosen to emphasize strategic synchronization amid complex global environment and a joint response to challenges, explained the well-known Chinese IR scholar Shen Yi. The recent China-Russia interactions don't stop there. On December 6th, China's Ministry of National Defense announced a joint missile defense exercise between the Chinese and Russian militaries inside Russia. The ministry stated that the exercise was not targeted at any third party and unrelated to current regional tensions, but unsurprisingly, it triggered extensive outside speculation. Now that we've covered China's diplomacy, let's look at the draft law that sparked major controversy inside China. The most contentious point is a clause that would withhold records of administrative violations that do not constitute criminal offenses. Once implemented, this would mean that the records of minor violations such as fighting, gambling, prostitution, or drug use would no longer be disclosed during background checks for employment or education. The legislative intent is to create a more supportive environment for those who committed minor violations but have genuinely reformed. From 2019 to 2023, China handled roughly 8 million public security cases per year. With undisclosed records, several million people annually could benefit and rebuild their social relationships. However, the clause had triggered massive controversy due to its perceived leniency on drug abuse. Given China's collective memory of the Opium War, China's anti-drug stance has remained firm and uncompromising since the founding of the PRC in 1949. In 2024 alone, China's anti-drug authorities handled 37,000 drug-related criminal cases, arrested 62,000 suspects, detained 193,000 drug users, and seized 26.7 tons of narcotics. As of the end of May, China had 710,000 registered drug users, and 4.339 million have completed the 3 years without relapse. These individuals are currently classified and managed according to the severity of their offenses. However, if the new rule passes, some drug use records will be removed from the public view. It remains to be seen in which direction the draft law will be further revised. Next, let's look at China's progress in reusable rockets. Last Thursday, China's fastest advancing reusable rocket company, Landspace, conducted a test flight of the Zhuque-3 rocket. The rocket successfully reached orbit, but the first-stage recovery encountered an anomaly and failed to achieve a soft landing. Simply put, it went up successfully but didn't land on its feet. Video from the launch site showed the booster returning with a stable altitude control and an intact body, even nearing the target landing area until an explosion occurred during the final deceleration burn. As the Chinese rocket closest to achieving reusability, the fall of Zhuque-3 came as a disappointment. But experts say the experience is still worth celebrating. Reason 1, the main objective of this test was orbital insertion, meaning the team was devoted few resources to the recovery task. From that perspective, Zhuque-3 fully achieved its primary goal. And reason 2, Zhuque-3 uses the same liquid oxygen, methane plus stainless steel structure as SpaceX's Starship, not China's conventional materials. The fact that Zhuque-3 survived re-entry and reached ground levels showed it passes aerodynamic and thermal protection challenges. Achieving a fully stable landing now depends only on more tests and time. Now let's talk about something with a sci-fi flavor: space rescue. If you follow spaceflight, you must remember the 2 NASA astronauts who were forced to stay an extra 9 months on the ISS due to the spacecraft issue earlier this year. In mid-November, China faced a similar situation but took only 20 days to bring the astronauts home safely. China's emergency was triggered by a shard of space debris about the size of a grain of dust, less than 1 mm. It cracked a window on the return capsule, and after astronauts photographed the damage and sent it back to Earth, ground experts analyzed it and decided not to risk using the damaged capsule. Chinese astronauts routinely rotate in teams of 3, and the crack was discovered during a shift transfer when 6 astronauts were operating simultaneously on the space station. China then decided to have the stranded 3 astronauts return to Earth using the capsule of their successors, and also launched an uncrewed capsule to bring back the remaining crew in the future. Within the tight time frame, China's aerospace engineers even prepared 2 rescue plans. Wu Dawei, deputy chief designer of the astronaut system at the China Astronauts Research and Training Center, joked that the only oversight was food for the 4 mice brought by Shenzhou 21. "We ended up giving them some of the astronauts' water and soy milk," he said. "They came back in very good health." As for the decommissioned 40 capsule, it will eventually return to Earth without the crew. The process will provide the data extremely valuable and meaningful for future missions. Finally, let's look at China's talent attraction. It turns out China's appeal to scientific talent goes far beyond ethnic Chinese. Recently, Nigel Slater, former Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge and a renowned scholar in chemical engineering and biopharmaceuticals, officially joined Zhejiang University. Having spent more than 3 decades at Cambridge, leading science and innovation, Slater said the move stems both from personal ambition and the global reshaping of the scientific landscape. The main motivation for joining Zhejiang University is research, he said last week, but I also greatly enjoy teaching undergraduates who are passionate and curious about biomedicine. It brings me tremendous satisfaction. At Zhejiang University's College for Chemical and Biological Engineering, Slater is working with Professor Jiabing Tang at Zhejiang Key Laboratory of Smart Biomaterials, focusing on next-generation cancer therapies that use virus and RNA-based vaccine technologies for tumor immunotherapy. Their work aims to prevent metastasis and recurrence in malignant cancers, a field once prohibitively expensive but now being revolutionized by China's cost-effective innovation. With Chinese biotech companies cutting the cost of personalized mRNA cancer vaccines to just 1% of the US prices, China is not only catching up, but leading in life science innovation. And that's all for today. See you next time.
Up next is our top pick segment. In this episode, we explore neoliberalism in the 21st century, the ideology behind today's crisis. We take a deeper look at how neoliberal thinking has shaped global politics and economics, and how its influence has negatively affected social stability, widening inequality, and fueling new political divides. We will also examine why many analysts believe this ideology lies at the center of today's most pressing global crisis.
In less than 30 days, we will hit a strange milestone. A full quarter of the 21st century is gone. The last 25 years haven't felt like the dawn of a bright new era. They feel like a sequence of shocks, one by one, each by each. We've lived through financial meltdowns, pandemics that shut down the world, and the return of great power rivalry that looks uncomfortably like the prologue to a new Cold War. The easy optimism of the 1990s has dissolved into a century defined by instability. At the center of that broken promise sits one idea: the neoliberalism. Over the past 25 years, neoliberalism has quietly rewritten the rules of global politics. What started as a doctrine of the Reagan-Thatcher right gradually became the ideological foundation of the center-left. And in the process, it morphed into something new, a neoliberal monster that covers itself in the language of social progress, while continuing to push the global working class deeper into insecurity and misery. To see how that transformation happened, we have to roll back the tape into the crisis of the 1960s and 1970s, the moment that opened the door for neoliberalism in the very first place. In the mid-20th century, the Western world ran on the Bretton Woods system, fixed exchange rates, tightly regulated finance, and a social democratic deal between labor, business, and the state. For a while it worked, but then the machine started to seize up, the growth slowed, productivity flattened, and the corporate profits were squeezed. On the ground, industrial workers faced layoffs and plant closures. In the United States, that pressure erupted into urban unrest and the racial riots of the late 1960s. Across Europe, extremist groups built on radical ideologies gained traction among young people, and they shook the government's confidence in the social stability. These were not random outbreaks of violence. They were the symptoms of a deeper structural crisis. Manufacturing industries were flooding markets with goods that no longer had enough buyers. Economists would later call this a crisis of overproduction, but at the time, policymakers saw something else: stagflation, the toxic mixture of low growth and high inflation that the Keynesian economics seemed unable to fix. As the US gold reserve drained away and global confidence in the dollar collapsed, the then President Richard Nixon pulled the plug on the Bretton Woods in 1971. So the US dollar was cut loose from gold. Floating exchange rates were born. A new age of global finance began. Out of that chaos, neoliberalism stepped forward. Fundamentally, it's an alternative theory, promising to restore the profitability, tame inflation, and bring the economic dynamism back to the system. By the 1980s, those ideas had found their political champions in Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Their programs like privatization, deregulation, tax cuts, all in the name of investment, and anti-inflation policies came to be known as supply-side economics. Their diagnoses sound very simple. The state was too big, labor protections too rigid, and taxes too high. The cure was to set markets free from bureaucratic constraints. And on the surface, it seemed to work. The inflation fell, growth picked up, financial markets roared again. For a moment, this Anglo-American model looked like the undisputed winner. But the cracks were visible from the very beginning. America's renewed dynamism had far less to do with tax cuts or deregulation than the story suggests. It was actually fueled by the Cold War arms race. The massive defense spending created a wave of high-tech demands that spilled into civilian industries, microchips, aerospace, communications. The government contracts, not pure market forces, actually powered much of this innovation. So the state was writing the checks while the free market took the credits. A second challenge also came from East Asia, where the countries like Japan, South Korea, and China's Taiwan province did something even more heretical. They ignored the neoliberal advice altogether, because their success actually came from the developmental state. It's a model like land reform, industrial planning, selective protectionism, and the tight management of their currencies to promote the exports. The Asian miracles broke every rule in the neoliberal playbook, but they still industrialized faster than any textbook free market economy ever had. So then came the moral challenge. The most enthusiastic early adopters of neoliberal reforms were not model democracies. They were actually the right-wing authoritarian regimes, like Chile under Pinochet became the template. The regime seized power in a military coup and brutally purged the socialists. They also imposed the neoliberal reform designed by these Chicago boys, which is basically a bunch of economists trained in the United States and flown in to remake the Chile's economy. These reforms privatized pensions, dismantled protections, and radical deregulation also happened, which would have been politically impossible in a functioning democracy. So Chile left neoliberalism with an unavoidable implication. To fully implement its program, a country often had to sideline, if not abandon, the very democracy which the West has claimed as its highest ideal. This undercuts Washington's new imperial project of regime change for freedom and democracy in the post-Cold War era. And worse for the neoliberal ideologues, Chile wasn't even the most successful authoritarian model, because East Asia, by comparison, its paternalistic developmental states were far more effective. If you were going to use authoritarian force, why not copy the version that actually delivers growth and industrial upgrading? So by the late 1990s, another awkward fact was also clear. The Reagan-era market reforms were not the real driver of America's tech boom either. The digital economy grew out of decades of the state-backed investment from the military, from public universities, from government research fundings that ultimately gave birth to the internet. So faced with all these sort of internal contradictions, neoliberalism evolved. So in the new century, it dropped its early obsession with restructuring the state from within. Instead, it turned outward and tried to reshape the entire societies through globalization. The fall of the Soviet Union, China's entry into the WTO, and India's market reforms created something unprecedented. It's a unified global labor market. For the first time in history, billions of workers now became accessible to the Western corporations. So the offshoring wasn't just an option, it was a business imperative. The production moved to the low-wage countries, handing corporations a new kind of leverage over national governments. So now the nation states had to compete to offer lower taxes, lighter regulations, and ever more business-friendly environments. This dynamic gave corporations enormous power over ordinary people. Popular demands for multinationals to pay higher taxes evaporated. The corporate lobbyists, they made a stunning threat. Unless the companies could keep more of their profits and pay this competitive compensation to executives and shareholders, they would move production elsewhere and take the jobs with them. So now for voters, the choice was framed in a very brutal term. You either lose your job now or accept more inequality later. So they naturally choose the latter because, unlike capital, the global labor movement could never act as one unitary actor. As tax rates fell across the world, governments were also pushed toward the privatization. Public services from transport to healthcare were steadily open to the private profits. Neoliberalism achieved one of its core aims, shrinking the power of the state without firing a single shot. As global markets expanded, immigration became another political tool. The parties competed to grow their voter bases, and then bringing in the new populations was the fastest and easiest route. Even when voters opposed large inflows of immigrants, the politicians still tolerated these sustained waves of illegal immigration, and later they pushed to regularize their status. Just look at what happened during the Biden-Harris administration. For the business, this influx of laborers expanded their pool of cheap laborers in services, logistics, construction, and even creating these entire business models built on undocumented workers. That served another key neoliberal objective, weakening the organized labor. When the supply of workers is constantly topped up, legally or illegally, the bargaining power of labor collapses. The trade unions struggle to organize, wages stagnate at the bottom. The abundance of labor becomes a feature, not a bug, of the neoliberal system. Most importantly, to achieve its primary objective, neoliberalism learned to live with the welfare state. It didn't just abolish the social safety nets, it actually adapted to them. As the poor people gained their basic security through public benefits, the consumption rose to more than 60% among the Western economies. So neoliberalism adjusted to this new landscape. Governments and households were encouraged to pile on the debts that fed to this growing financial sector. Manufacturing was pushed aside by the services industry. The cheap imported goods flooded the shelves of the supermarkets. High-tech industries built business models not on raising productivity, but on stimulating consumption. Think about how Silicon Valley uses social media platforms to influence you, to change your behavior, even your mind. Out of this shift came a new kind of middle class, the so-called knowledge economy workers. Their outlook lined up perfectly with the progressive values of this modern center-left, under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you name it. So to secure the loyalty of this new base, the center-left party struck a deal with the devil. It's the same parties that had once attacked neoliberalism for hurting workers and minorities, now embrace it full-heartedly. Because neoliberal globalization had created these very new people that now they depend on, the urban professionals, media workers, academics. The social democratic parties from the Democrats in the US and the Labour Party in the UK rebranded themselves as the third-way centrists. They signed up for the financial deregulation, free trade, and mass immigration. They saw deglobalization not just as an economic strategy, but as a moral mission, a moral project. The open markets and open societies will fuse into a single ideological package. For the new urban professional class, it felt like the natural worldview for them. So that transformation has produced a paradox, which run through the 21st century. For economies like China's Hong Kong or Argentina under Milei, which supposedly are the model students of this pure neoliberal economics, with free markets, free capital flows, and minimal governments. But they no longer count as part of this neoliberal family across the world, because the moment they align with a nationalist or socially conservative politics, the Western neoliberals will treat them as heretics. Meanwhile, the mixed economies like France or Australia are celebrated simply because they embrace massive immigrations. So the problem was never just about economics. It was always about politics. This evolution shattered the traditional conservative parties. So now they face a brutal choice. They either modernize by adopting progressive cultural positions that reflected the taste of this new globalized professional class, or drift toward electoral extinction. The results were often serial. Like George W. Bush sold his regime change wars in the Middle East as missions to defend women's rights. David Cameron's Conservative Party in Britain championed the same-sex marriage and turned it into a political brand. Debates over political correctness swallowed the public sphere, even as neoliberal policies deepened the inequality among people and drove the public debts toward the red line all the way to the roof. And that is the heart of today's political crisis. After losing cultural battles over sexuality, gender, race, and national identity, many of the conservative parties walk away from neoliberal globalization and reach for the nationalist populism instead. The new right now wages war on neoliberalism, not primarily as an economic doctrine, but as a cultural power base of the center-left, built on the cosmopolitanism, diversity politics, and the interests of the knowledge economy class. And of course, the complete neglect of everyone else left behind. That shift is making neoliberalism even more brutal. The new right now has ripped off its humane mask and pushes for a blood-soaked laissez-faire lasting in the 19th century. auctioning political influence, normalizing corruption, and manipulating financial markets with impunity. The world now will risk sliding into a new Gilded Age, a rule of robber barons where the oligarchs call all the shots. If the trend continues, the political tensions will only sharpen. The Western world may be heading toward its darkest moment since the 1920s, and all the signs point to a new era of political upheaval, one in which the fresh ideologies born from the discontent with neoliberalism will reshape the entire structure of political alignment across the world. Whether that transformation will go, or whether the story could have gone another way, is a question we will explore in the next episode. Thanks for watching, and this is Curtis at Sinopolitik. Stay tuned.
Next on the show is Roughly Chinese. In this episode, Mauro Ramos Pintus, Brazil de facto's correspondent in China, and Yonis Gedi Alaso, executive producer of Pan-Africanism Today, take us on a journey through China's rural development and urban innovation. From Shenzhen's thriving goji berry project to the quiet, orderly streets of Shanghai, they share their reflections on how central coordination, technological progress, and cultural harmony continue to shape livelihoods and everyday life across the country.
Last time when I went to Xinjiang, I was in a place that they produce the goji berry. So historically in that the county, they produce the goji berry, but then together with the local leaders from the party, Communist Party of China, and some companies, some private investors, and the farmers, they come up with a project to improve the production and improve the livelihood of the farmers, and to bring new products, like improved products. So there's I don't know, a goji beer, some medicine. It was the first time that I saw like the raw goji berry. And this is interesting because this is the party, the centrality of the party, conducting all the actors in the society, and to achieve this goal of common prosperity. I don't know if this was something that always has been there, but this is now, I see clearly in different parts of the country how the party at the center of the system is able to harmonize all the different forces. And this is the harmony, I think, is a word that I've been learning a lot here, because you have the harmony between different actors, but also, for instance, from within different ethnicities. Yeah. So we think here like we have 56 ethnicities in China, and sometimes I think when we came here, or different journalists from different countries here, they're taking for granted the harmony among the ethnicities here in China. But if you go to like other countries, sometimes there's a problem, you know, and we've been told that in some cases there was a problem before, and this is one of the concerns also of the party. That's why we have like autonomous regions, autonomous prefectures. So I think the thing about the common prosperity and the harmony among all the actors in China is one of the things I think I learned, because you never end up learning. It's like I was thinking that like I know 0.01% of China.
Yeah. Oh, me too. I'm so overwhelmed here all the time. Yeah. And I'm sure you've been to so many places and you're still like barely scratched the surface.
Yes.
There's so much more
totally.
to learn, right? But I think it's amazing that you had these reflections and this insight onto the harmony of the different cultural groups and ethnicities in China through the goji berry. I think that's really lovely. So thank you for sharing. What about you, Yonis?
I found strange is, again, you walk in the streets of Shanghai, and understand Shanghai is not all of China is Shanghai. It's quite different. Yeah. But you walk in the streets here, and it's how quiet it is because of all the electric vehicles. Again, if you are in Kampala or Dar es Salaam or Accra, you cannot have a conversation with someone because of the amount of. Firstly, there's a lot of fumes. but there's also just the noise. And again, this contradiction between, and because the vehicles, most capital cities in Africa, those are old European vehicles that got dumped in the African market. So it's a second-hand car that when the European Union passed legislations to say that we want certain greenhouse gas emissions, those cars, they didn't stop greenhouse gas emissions for the world. They just took those cars that produce too much greenhouse gases and dumped them in some African country where they are now producing greenhouse gases while I'm talking to my friends. So this contradiction, again, between the kind of technological advancements of China on the one hand, and the fact that that most vehicles in most parts of Africa are vehicles deemed not good enough for the West that are now being driven on our continent.
Let's now move on to the Thinkers Forum, which this week features an in-depth interview with political commentator and China expert Sean Rain. In the first part of the conversation, Sean offers a deep dive into China-Japan tensions, breaking down the historical grievances, strategic calculations, and current geopolitical pressures shaping this complex relationship. In the second part, we shift focus to the United States to examine America's war machine and explore why warmongers so often rise to power, tracing the political incentives, economic interest, and institutional forces that drive Washington's confrontational posture on the global stage.
So over the last few weeks, tensions have flared between China and Japan, because to the Chinese, it's very clear that Japan, under the new Prime Minister Takaichi, is trying to provoke a battle, provoke tension with China by saying that if China were to reunify with Taiwan, that this would be a security threat to Japan, and Japan would have to move. Now, for many of my fellow Americans, they view this as China is trying to oppress Taiwan, China is trying to oppress Japan. And a large part of that is because there's been a rewriting of history. And one of the issues that I wanted to bring up to the listeners and viewers here is why China is so concerned about Japan's moves. I think first, a lot of foreigners don't realize exactly what Japan did to China and the rest of Asia during World War II. They enslaved hundreds of thousands of Chinese and South Korean women and from other nationalities and forced them to be sex slaves for the Japanese Imperial Army. They killed tens of millions of Chinese in their invasion, not just of Manchuria in the northeastern part of China, but when they came all the way down through the country. And they also, in Unit 731, launched a lot of biological human test experiments in the same way that Joseph Mengele did in Auschwitz when, as a Nazi against Jews and Romanis and homosexuals. So a lot of people say to me, but Sean, these were atrocities that Japan committed 80 years ago. This has nothing to do with modern Japan. This is the Chinese that are whipping up nationalism, whipping up propaganda from the Communist Party of China to try to create an us versus them attitude and to sort of get the Chinese not to be so upset about failings with the CPC and the weak economy. But here's the thing. Japan itself has not really acknowledged what happened during World War II. There have been some light apologies here and there in the 1980s from a prime minister, but many Japanese in the government do not admit exactly what happened in World War II. So the fear among Chinese, and let's be honest, fear among South Koreans, Singaporeans, Malaysians, and other countries in Asia that suffered under the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II is that could happen again. If you don't know your own history, you're bound to repeat it. Now, let me give you an example. I did my graduate studies at Harvard, and one of my classmates was really a wonderful person. I enjoyed talking with this classmate, but this classmate was sent by Japan's government to Harvard to learn about America, learn about China, and build up relations. And this classmate told me that the comfort woman, the hundreds of thousands of Chinese and South Korean women that were enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army weren't raped, which they were, often up to 50 times a day by 50 different men, but they were happy being comfort women because these Chinese were so poor And the Japanese government gave them a few dollars a day. So it was worth it for them to do. So here's the problem. Many Japanese are rewriting history. They don't acknowledge what they did or what their ancestors did during World War II. And if you don't recognize what you did, you're bound to repeat it again. Japan is doubling their military defense budget over the next 5 years versus 10 years for China. Japan is talking with NATO about potentially opening up a NATO office in Tokyo. So for all of the nations in Asia, they're starting to get more and more nervous about an aggressive Japanese state that's rewriting history. So I used to live in the Philippines. I taught at Trinity College of Quezon City in Manila. I also worked with a tribe doing aid work in Sagada in Mountain Province. I also taught English in Bundang in South Korea, a suburb of Seoul. I studied at NTU in Singapore, and obviously I've spent most of the last 28 years of my life in China. And when I interviewed old people in their 80s, in the 1990s, when I lived in all these countries, they all said surprisingly similar stories about the atrocities committed by the Japanese Imperial Army. They talked about murders, they talked about rapes, they talked about torture and mutilation. And this is something that people in their 80s, again, from many different countries, from different races, different religions, from different political systems, all said the same thing about Japan. And it's important, I think, that America, that the world recognizes and remembers exactly what Japan did during World War II, because there's a reason why Japan was not allowed to have its own military and was only allowed to have self-defense forces. There is a reason why Germany also was not supposed to have an offensive military force. It's because these two countries unleashed devastation across the world. And again, to give credit to Germany, they've made atonement for World War II, and they recognize the atrocities that their country did 80 years ago. But the Japanese haven't. And so you see, Foreign Minister Wang Yi from China met with the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, to talk about we need to maintain and ensure the post-World War II order, where we have open trade, where we ensure that the people who unleashed tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people dying, billions suffering during World War II, don't rearm, don't become overly nationalistic, where they could cause a World War III. I think it's a reminder from Russia and China to the whole world that they need to learn from history. Because you see, it's being rewritten, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. You see Kaja Kallas, the head of foreign policy for the European Union, has rewritten how many countries have invaded Russia, how many countries Russia invaded in Europe. She's taken a very warlike, warmongering stance against China. And when you see some of the religious and ethnic hatred and what's going on in Europe right now, it just gets everybody scared. And I think that's why Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, is trying to remind everyone, the dangers of forgetting history, the dangers of letting countries that, truth be told, are historically aggressive from rearming again. I'm half Jewish. I'm very proud of being half Jewish. My family came from Germany. But I don't get scared about Germany in the same way that I get scared about Japan, because Germany, to their credit, teach in their schools exactly what the Nazis did to Jews in the 1940s. It's illegal to be a Nazi or a neo-Nazi in Germany. And they've paid reparations and they've made many apologies. So it's very clear to Jews that Germany is atoning for their ancestors' sins in the 1930s and 1940s. And that's why you look at it, Germany and Israel are extremely close right now. And actually, Germany might even be Israel's biggest supporter in the world. Japan, again, is not acknowledging the atrocities that their ancestors committed. And that's why people are scared throughout Asia. So there's a question of whether the Prime Minister of Japan has taken a truculent tone trying to provoke China from her own accord, or if she's being used as a vassal by the United States and Trump, who's trying to create maybe a proxy war with China the way that many in China think the United States did with Ukraine against Russia. I don't really know what the story is. You have, Wei Ling, a correspondent from the Wall Street Journal, has said that, Trump pushed Japan's prime minister to take a softened stance. But then the Japanese government said that Wei Ling was incorrect. Now, she's often, spreading misinformation and disinformation about what happens at the geopolitical level. But what's clear is that Japan has 50,000 American troops on their soil. They have almost 100 military bases from the US in Japan, and they actually have their own American military police patrol Okinawa. So Japan is not a sovereign nation that can make geopolitical decisions on its own without the support of the United States. When you look at it, a lot of Japan's political leaders over the last 80 years, from Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister who was assassinated, his grandparents, one of them was a crasse war criminal during World War II, but they were supported by the United States. So since the end of World War II, a lot of Japan's politicians have gotten the support, the money, just the backing from the US. And that's why Japan is so close to the United States. While you compare that with China, or you should contrast it with China, if you look at the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China today, from Xi Jinping all the way down to the number 7 person, none of those actually studied in the United States. None of them owe their political power to American imperialism. And that's why they're not puppets of the US. So one of the problems about America and American history is we are a very violent nation coming from our roots. Whether it be the genocide of Native Americans or Indians, whether it be slavery, whether it be the Japanese Internment Act during World War II, where we took all Japanese and put them into essentially concentration camps, whether it be the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I think America is a wonderful country, but unfortunately, we've often treated minorities in a very negative light. And we've also been very violent and aggressive. It's a very cowboy gunslinger type of country. One of the most dangerous countries that I visited. I've traveled to dozens and dozens of countries around the world, and America, despite being the wealthiest nation, will still have homeless, drugged out, mentally ill people roaming the streets. And so you have a very aggressive society. And I think that builds up into the culture in DC to be aggressive. The second thing is the United States has a problem with its liberal democracy and the voting system. You have special interest groups, you have wealthy donors donate to politicians and essentially control them. And one of the problems you've had in the last 10 years, and this might sound xenophobic, but I don't mean it to be, but a lot of the biggest donors in the United States right now were not born in America. And they weren't born with the American value system. You see, George Soros was not born in America. Elon Musk was not born in America. Miriam Adelson was not born in America. Rupert Murdoch, who is the big media conglomerate who owns Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, he was not born in America. So we are an immigrant nation. These are Americans. They should be embraced. The problem, though, is they don't have the same value system, in my mind, as everyday Americans who went through the American education system and learned what it meant to be American. And a lot of these donors are essentially trying to transform America into their image of what America is supposed to be, and not what our forefathers who wrote the Declaration of Independence wanted America to be. They also benefit financially, too many of the donors, too many of the politicians, from warmongering. They either get more power politically, or they make more money by creating weapons. You see, one of the differences between China and the United States is that Chinese military officials, when they retire, they retire. Their homes their cars, their food, their travel budgets, everything is still provided to them from the Communist Party. So they still have to heed what the government leaders want. In the United States, many of the military defense people end up working for weapon manufacturers or end up working for private equity. So you see Lloyd Austin, he ran Iraq military for the United States. Then he went to become a board member of Raytheon, the weapon manufacturer, before he became Secretary of Defense. You see people like Dick Cheney, he was the Secretary of Defense, then he went to the military construction contractor Halliburton before becoming Vice President. You see like Jim Straveris, who I believe led NATO, and now he works for the private equity firm Carlyle Group, doing a lot of military issues. So the problem is in the United States, there's the incentive for military leaders, political leaders, and donors, combined with America's natural history for aggression towards people of other races and minorities and religions. And this creates this recipe where America becomes very aggressive globally. And it's a dangerous situation, which is why I believe in a multipolar world. I don't want America to be the lone leader. I certainly don't want China to be the lone leader. I wouldn't want Russia or France or any country. But I do believe in a multipolar world that will help keep countries a little bit more honest and a little bit more pensive and slow in doing things. Because unfortunately for America right now, is attack first is what a lot of people in DC and their donors want.
And that brings us to the end of this week's edition of China Now. I am Makiza Latifa, and it's a pleasure guiding you through the stories, insights, and conversations shaping China and the world today. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll be back next week with more analysis, more perspectives, and more voices. Until then, take care and stay informed. See you soon.